Ethan Parker was a man who lived a life of routine. At 29, he had worked tirelessly to carve a name for himself as a professional photographer in Phoenix, Arizona. His career was his passion, and it consumed him, day and night, capturing moments for weddings, corporate events, and family portraits. But there was one thing he always believed in: his marriage to Sarah, his wife of 3 years. They had met in college, and everything about their relationship had felt destined. Sarah was his support, his anchor. She had always been the one to encourage him when doubts crept in, and in return Ethan worked hard to provide them with the life he thought they both dreamed of. But that was before everything changed. It had been months since Ethan noticed something was different about Sarah. Little things at first: her distracted gaze, the coldness in her voice when she spoke to him, the way she seemed to withdraw from their shared life. He had brushed it off as stress or perhaps the weight of their busy schedules. He was always gone, always working, and she was alone. He thought it was just a phase, something that would pass. But one evening, after a long day of shooting a corporate gala, Ethan returned home earlier than usual, eager to spend time with Sarah. The house was quiet, and for a moment he thought she had gone out. Then as he passed the back door, he noticed the faint sound of voices, low, intimate, muffled by the thick wooden door. His heart skipped a beat. He paused, straining to listen, and what he heard next shook him to his core. It was Sarah's voice, laced with laughter, a warmth that Ethan hadn't heard in months. But it wasn't directed at him. It was for Chris, their old friend, a man Ethan trusted. They had known Chris for years. He had been part of their small circle since college. But now he was in their home, speaking to Sarah in a way that made Ethan's stomach turn. The familiarity in their words, the laughter, the shared secrets, it was all so clear now. Ethan's instinct screamed at him to turn away, to leave before he witnessed something he couldn't undo. But something held him in place. His feet moved, almost of their own accord, and before he knew it he was standing at the edge of the sliding door, peering inside. What he saw next made his blood run cold. Sarah and Chris were sitting on the garden bench in the backyard, close enough that their shoulders brushed against each other. Chris was speaking softly, but his words were too clear. Ethan couldn't make out everything, but the tone was unmistakable, flirtatious, affectionate. And then Sarah's words cut through the silence, sharp and final. "You know, Ethan, I'm so tired of living this way," Sarah said, her voice cold as it traveled through the air. "I need something more. Chris makes me feel appreciated, something you never have." Ethan's breath caught in his chest. The air felt thick, suffocating. He couldn't move, couldn't speak. The world around him seemed to spin as her words echoed in his mind. He had worked so hard, sacrificed so much to build a life for them, to build a future. And yet it wasn't enough. His mind raced. The late nights spent photographing events, the weekends he missed with her, everything he had done was in vain. She didn't need him anymore. She had found someone else to fill the emptiness. Ethan's heart shattered in that moment, but he didn't let it show. He couldn't let it show. His hands were shaking, his body rigid, as he stood there listening to Sarah's betrayal. Every word, every laugh, every shared glance between Sarah and Chris dug deeper into his chest like a knife. Then Sarah looked up and saw him standing there just beyond the door. Her face froze for a moment, a flash of guilt crossing her features before it was replaced by something colder, detachment. "You heard me, didn't you?" she asked, her voice no longer warm but icy, distant. "I don't want to pretend anymore. I've made my choice, Ethan." The words hung in the air, and in that moment Ethan knew there was nothing left to salvage. His entire world, his marriage, his trust, his love, was crumbling in front of him, and all he could do was watch. There was no room for argument, no room for explanation. She had made her decision. Sarah stood up, walking toward him with a slow, deliberate pace, but Ethan could barely move. He was rooted to the spot, his legs heavy with the weight of betrayal. "I'm sorry, Ethan," she said, but there was no sincerity in her voice. I'm not happy anymore." The words that came out of his mouth surprised him. He had always prided himself on being the calm one, the one who kept his emotions in check. But now all he felt was a mixture of rage and sorrow. "Sorry?" Ethan's voice was barely a whisper, trembling with the effort it took to keep himself from shouting. "You've been lying to me and now you're sorry?" Sarah's expression didn't change, but Chris stepped forward from the shadows, looking uncomfortable but resolute. Ethan turned his gaze back to Sarah, his eyes filled with pain. He could feel his heart breaking with every passing second, but it was as if he had already lost her. The Sarah he knew was gone, and in her place stood someone he didn't recognize. "I'm done, Ethan," Sarah said, her voice firm now. "I'm leaving." Without another word, she walked past him, heading toward the front door, leaving Ethan standing alone in the backyard, the night air cold against his skin. The silence that followed was deafening. Ethan stood frozen in the backyard, the cool night air swirling around him, carrying with it the remnants of words that had torn his life apart. His gaze was fixed on the spot where Sarah had stood moments ago. Her absence felt like a heavy weight pressing down on him, suffocating him. The backyard, once a place of laughter and memories, now felt cold and foreign. He didn't know how long he stood there, caught in the haze of disbelief and anger. The stars above offered no comfort, the quiet of the night only deepened the silence in his heart. It was as if the world had stopped spinning, leaving him stuck in a moment he couldn't escape from. Finally, Ethan turned and made his way back into the house. His footsteps echoed through the empty hallways, each sound amplifying the emptiness that now surrounded him. He moved toward their bedroom, his mind numb, but there was a sharp ache in his chest that he couldn't ignore. The bed was unmade, just as it had been earlier that day before everything fell apart. He stood at the doorway, staring at the place where he had shared so many quiet moments with Sarah, where they had built their life together. Now it felt like a ghost of what it once was. He couldn't stay here. Without another thought, Ethan grabbed his car keys and left. He didn't know where he was going, only that he couldn't remain in the house in the city, with the memory of Sarah haunting every corner. As he drove through the streets of Phoenix, the city lights blurring past him, Ethan felt like a stranger in his own life. He had spent so long building a future with Sarah, but now it was gone, and he was left with nothing but the wreckage of his own dreams. He found a small apartment in the heart of downtown Phoenix, a place far from their old home. It wasn't much, just a one-bedroom unit in a building that smelled faintly of old wood and dust. But it was his now. A fresh start even if it didn't feel like it. In the days that followed, Ethan buried himself in his work. He took every gig he could get, pushing himself harder than ever. Weddings, corporate events, parties, anything to keep his mind occupied. He had always found solace behind the lens of his camera, capturing moments frozen in time, but now it felt different. The work was no longer just a passion, it was an escape. Every click of the shutter, every edited photo, was a distraction from the mess his life had become. The apartment became his sanctuary, though it was small and simple. He spent long hours there, sorting through old photos, processing his feelings, but more often than not, he found himself lying awake at night, staring at the ceiling, unable to quiet his racing thoughts. He couldn't shake the image of Sarah and Chris together, her eyes soft with affection, her smile something he no longer recognized. But slowly something began to change. The steady stream of photography jobs gave him purpose. He no longer had the luxury of time to dwell on the past. His focus shifted. His portfolio grew. He started taking on more prestigious events, and soon he was being sought after by high-end clients. Companies, magazines, and even a few well-known advertising agencies took notice of his work. The recognition was gradual at first, but it fueled something inside of him, a fire he thought had been extinguished when Sarah walked away. One afternoon he received an email from a major advertising firm. They had seen his work online and wanted to hire him for a high-profile campaign. Ethan stared at the email, disbelief washing over him. He had worked so hard, struggled for so long, but this felt different. This was the breakthrough he had been waiting for. He immediately replied, setting up a meeting to discuss the details. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of photo shoots, meetings, and late nights spent editing images. For the first time in months, Ethan felt alive again. His work was thriving, and with every new project he felt like he was rediscovering the man he had once been. The passionate photographer, the one who didn't need the approval of anyone, least of all Sarah. But even as his professional life took off, Ethan couldn't completely silence the voice in his head. Every now and then he would catch himself wondering how Sarah was doing. What was she and Chris up to? Was she happy now that she had everything she thought she wanted? It was on one of these nights, when the silence of his apartment seemed to suffocate him, that he received a text from Sarah. It had been months since they last spoke. She had tried calling him a few times, but he had ignored her. This time the message was short. "I'm sorry, Ethan. I was wrong. Can we talk?" Ethan stared at the screen for what felt like an eternity. He didn't know how to respond. The hurt still lingered, sharp and raw. But he had come so far, built so much since that night. Was he really ready to open that door again? He put the phone down and walked to his balcony. The cool Phoenix air brushed against his face as he looked out over the city skyline. The world was moving on. He was moving on. Maybe it was time for Sarah to realize that too. Ethan had grown accustomed to his new life. His days were filled with meetings, photo shoots, and the constant hum of creativity. He had built a rhythm, a routine that felt like his own. The pain of the past still lingered in the quiet moments, but it was easier to ignore now. His career was thriving, and for the first time in a long while, he was proud of what he had accomplished. But life, as it often did, had a way of throwing curveballs. It was a month after the text from Sarah that he found himself in the middle of one. One evening, as Ethan was preparing to leave for another photo shoot, he received an unexpected call. The number was unfamiliar, but he answered it anyway. "Ethan, it's Chris." Ethan froze, the name sending a cold chill through him. Chris. The man who had torn his life apart, the man who had stolen the trust and love that he thought was unshakable. His hands tightened around his phone, his chest constricting with emotions he had long buried. "What do you want?" Ethan asked, his voice flat, controlled, but the anger was there, simmering beneath the surface. "I know you probably don't want to talk to me, but I've got something you need to hear," Chris said, his voice low, almost hesitant. "It's about Sarah." Ethan could feel his heart rate quicken. What could he possibly say about Sarah that Ethan didn't already know? The truth had already been laid bare, and Ethan had no intention of reopening old wounds. "What about her?" Ethan replied, trying to keep the edge of his voice from cracking. "She's not happy, man. I don't know what you think, but she's miserable. She thought she wanted freedom, but now she regrets it. It's not what she expected." Ethan's thoughts swirled. Chris's words, though unexpected, didn't surprise him. Sarah had always been someone who sought approval, who sought validation from the world around her. But hearing it from Chris of all people, someone who had been part of their betrayal, stung in a way that was hard to describe. "I don't want to hear this, Chris," Ethan snapped. "Whatever it is, it's too late. I've moved on." Chris hesitated, but his voice became more urgent. "I'm not trying to make you go back to her, Ethan. She's been calling you. She says she's sorry, but it's more than that. She's lost. She wants to fix things, but she doesn't know how." The words hung in the air. Ethan had heard this before, from Sarah herself. But hearing it from Chris felt like a different kind of betrayal, a reminder that the world they had once shared was now shattered. He didn't know if he should feel pity or anger. The truth was he didn't feel much at all. "Why are you telling me this?" Ethan finally asked. "Because I think you deserve to know," Chris replied, his tone surprisingly sincere. "I've made mistakes, man. I've hurt both of you. And I know what we did, it was wrong. But I can't stand by and watch her destroy herself anymore. She's not the same person she was." Ethan exhaled slowly, his grip on the phone tightening. The idea of Sarah being in pain, genuinely suffering, was a foreign thought. She had chosen this path and now she was facing the consequences. But was that enough? Did he have to feel bad for her? "I don't know what you want from me, Chris," Ethan said. "It's over. She made her choice." There was a long pause before Chris spoke again. "I know. But I wanted to tell you that she's trying to make things right. Whether you want her back or not is up to you, but she needs you to hear her out. I can't do this for her anymore." Ethan stood still for a moment, trying to process what Chris had said. The truth was he didn't want to revisit the past. He had worked hard to get to this place, to build a life without Sarah. He had been through so much, endured the heartache, the anger, and now it seemed like Sarah was the one struggling to find her way. But wasn't that the point? Wasn't that the reason he had walked away in the first place? To give her the space to figure out what she really wanted? "Thanks for letting me know," Ethan finally said, his voice cold but calm. "But this isn't my problem anymore. I don't need her to fix anything." After a brief pause, Chris sighed. "I get it. I just thought you should know. Take care of yourself, Ethan." The line went dead and Ethan stood there for a moment, still processing the conversation. Later that evening, as Ethan sat at his desk editing photos for another upcoming shoot, he thought about what Chris had said. But it was difficult to care. As the days passed, Sarah's attempts to reach out grew more frequent, but Ethan ignored them all. Her voice on the other end of the line, the desperate tone of her messages, they didn't move him anymore. He had built something new, something real. His work, his career, his life, he didn't need the chaos of the past back in it. The thing was, Sarah had chosen her path and Chris was part of it now. She could live with that. Ethan was no longer the man who would bend to anyone's will. He had learned that the only person he could rely on was himself. Weeks passed since the conversation with Chris, and Ethan's life continued its steady course. His work flourished, the recognition from high-end clients and the opportunities he had always dreamed of now at his fingertips. He had created a rhythm in his life, a dance between the long hours behind the camera and the quiet moments in his small apartment. The loneliness was still there, but it wasn't as suffocating as it once was. He was learning to live with it. More importantly, he was learning to live for himself. One afternoon, after another successful photo shoot, Ethan received another message from Sarah. This time it wasn't just a text. It was a long letter, one that seemed to spill out all the emotions Sarah had been holding inside. She apologized, explained herself, and begged for another chance. She spoke of regret, of how she had realized too late the value of what she had thrown away. She mentioned how she had been lost, caught up in the idea of freedom, only to discover that without him, nothing felt right. Ethan sat on his couch, reading the message over and over, his mind a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. Part of him wanted to give in, to let her back into his life, to take her hand and try to piece together the fragments of what they had. But another part of him, the part that had worked so hard to rebuild himself, knew better. He knew that forgiving her wasn't going to fix anything. He wasn't the same man he was when they first met. He had changed. He had become someone stronger, someone who didn't need to be defined by a past that no longer served him. As the days went by, Sarah's calls and messages became more desperate, more pleading. But each time Ethan deleted the message before he could hear it all. Each time he felt a little less inclined to respond. He had already moved on. He had found his peace. Then, one chilly evening in early spring, Ethan found himself facing her once more. It was an unplanned encounter. He had been invited to an event by a client, a gala that he was photographing. He hadn't expected Sarah to be there, but as he walked through the crowd, he saw her across the room. She stood near the bar, her eyes scanning the crowd, her face a mix of uncertainty and resolve. The instant their eyes met, something in Ethan shifted. He hadn't seen her in months, and yet, the sight of her was like a punch to the gut. The old wounds flared up for a moment, but they didn't consume him. He could feel the weight of the past trying to pull him back in, but he stood firm, his gaze never leaving hers. Sarah took a step toward him, and he could see the hesitation in her movements. She looked different, more mature, more fragile, like she had weathered her own storm. "Ethan," she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. "I've been waiting for you to come to me. To hear me out." Ethan's heart thudded in his chest, but he kept his face neutral, his voice steady. "I've heard everything I need to hear, Sarah. I know what I did was wrong. I've spent every day regretting it," she continued, her eyes filling with tears. "I didn't know how much I needed you until it was too late. I just want to know if there's a chance for us to fix this. I want to try, Ethan. Please." Ethan took a deep breath, his mind racing, his heart pounding. There was a part of him, just a small part, that wanted to reach out, to forgive her, to go back to the way things were. But deep down he knew that was impossible. They couldn't go back. Not after everything that had happened. "You had your chance, Sarah," he said, his voice calm but firm. "You made your choice. And so did I." She flinched, the words hitting her like a physical blow. Her eyes searched his face, but he didn't look away. There was no more sadness, no more longing. Just a quiet certainty. "I've moved on, Sarah," Ethan said softly but with finality. "I've built something for myself, something real. And it doesn't include you. You chose Chris, you chose freedom, and now you have to live with that." Sarah's expression crumbled, her tears spilling over as she reached out to him. "Please, Ethan. Don't leave me. I made a mistake." But Ethan took a step back, his face expressionless. "I'm not the man I was when we were together. And I won't be the man you need me to be. I've let go of the past. It's time for you to do the same." With that, Ethan turned and walked away, his steps steady and sure. He could hear Sarah's voice calling after him, but he didn't look back. There was no need to. He had already made his choice. As he stepped out into the cool night air, he felt a sense of freedom that he hadn't experienced in months. The city stretched out before him, vast and full of possibilities. He had finally reclaimed his life. The weight of Sarah's betrayal was gone, replaced by the knowledge that he was in control of his own future. Ethan wasn't angry anymore. He wasn't sad. He was at peace. And for the first time in a long while, he felt ready for whatever came next.